Here it is. The troop movement orders for the Ardennes.
But that division was supposed to be held in reserve.
Just fill this part out here, slowly. And make sure you sign the last page.
The 12th Corps is stalled here by the river.
We need to reroute the supplies through this sector immediately.
Spring 1945, Southern Germany. The war is over, but the silence is not peace. It is inspection. A former administrative hall, once adorned with banners and insignia, now stands bare. The walls are scrubbed clean. No symbols remain, only desks, chairs, papers stacked with precision. A line of women stands under fluorescent light. Their uniforms are gone. Civilian coats hang stiff on narrow shoulders. Some still carry the posture of authority. Others do not know where to place their hands. Boots echo across the floor as American officers move between tables, calm and methodical. On each desk lies a single document, typed in German and English. An oath, a renunciation, a declaration that the ideology they served no longer exists, at least not here. Names are called. One by one, they step forward. Pens are offered. The words are read aloud. There is no shouting, no insults, only procedure. The humiliation is quiet. It comes not from force, but from certainty. These women were once officers, administrators, leaders within the Nazi system. Now, they are required to deny it, publicly, permanently, before strangers who defeated their nation. As ink touches paper, something irreversible happens. Not just to them, but to Germany itself. By the time these women stood in line, Nazi Germany had already ceased to exist. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler was dead. A week later, on May 7th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender at Reims. The document took effect the following day. The Third Reich collapsed, not with a final battle, but with administrative silence. Orders stopped coming. Radios went quiet. Units dissolved without ceremony. Across Europe, Allied forces moved quickly to secure what remained. The United States Army, advancing deep into central and southern Germany, found not just destroyed cities, but a defeated state still filled with people who had once enforced its ideology. Washington had anticipated this moment. Long before Berlin fell, American planners debated how to handle a nation that had mobilized an entire society around Nazism. The concern was not only military. It was moral, psychological, and political. Germany had not merely been ruled by the Nazi Party. It had been organized through it. The U.S. Army entered Germany not only as a conquering force, but as a governing authority. Under the Office of Military Government, United States, known as OMGUS, American officers assumed control of civil administration, courts, police, education, and employment. Their task was unprecedented: dismantle a totalitarian ideology without destroying the population that had lived under it. The Allies agreed on one central principle. Nazism had to be removed entirely, not suppressed, not rebranded, eliminated. This policy became known as Denazification. The concept was simple in theory and immense in practice. Anyone who had held authority within a Nazi system, political, military, educational, industrial, would be identified, classified, and judged. Their future would depend not on battlefield actions, but on ideological affiliation. In the American zone, denazification was systematic. It relied on paperwork, not spectacle. The most visible instrument was the Fragebogen, a detailed questionnaire containing more than 100 questions. It asked about party membership, rank, duties, income, associations, publications, and beliefs. Every adult German applying for employment, housing, or ration cards was required to complete it. But some individuals were not processed quietly. Those identified as officials, officers, or ideological functionaries were summoned directly. They were brought to screening centers, former schools, offices, and camps now repurposed for assessment. There, they faced not a trial in the conventional sense, but a reckoning. The American command believed that ideology could not survive humiliation. Power, once stripped of symbols, had to be publicly denied. For former Nazi leaders, renunciation was not optional. This applied to men immediately and visibly. But soon, it became clear that women could not be exempt. Throughout the war, Allied intelligence had underestimated the extent of female participation in Nazi governance. Early assumptions portrayed German women primarily as supporters, followers, or victims of the regime. The reality uncovered in 1945 was far more complex. Women had administered offices, enforced policy, supervised camps, managed propaganda, and trained youth. Many wore no combat uniform, but they exercised authority nonetheless. As the American occupation deepened, these women entered the Denazification system, not as civilians caught in the aftermath, but as representatives of a defeated ideology. And it was here, in the bureaucratic aftermath of total war, that their past roles would be examined, line by line, signature by signature, leading directly into the next phase of the process. The Nazi state had never relied solely on men. From its earliest years, the regime had woven women into its structure, not as equals in combat, but as essential administrators, organizers, and enforcers of ideology. By the late 1930s, the system was already dependent on them. By 1944, it could not function without them. Female participation took many forms. Some were visible. Others were deliberately ordinary. Within the National Socialist German Workers' Party, women held positions in auxiliary leadership organizations. The National Socialist Women's League managed welfare, education, and ideological training. The League of German Girls shaped youth loyalty from childhood. These are not symbolic groups. They controlled budgets, issued directives, and enforced conformity at the local level. As the war expanded, women moved deeper into state machinery. Thousands served as clerical officers within the SS and Wehrmacht, handling personnel files, transport orders, and camp records. Others worked as radio operators, intelligence typists, and communications supervisors. In concentration and labor camps, female guards, Aufseherin, held direct authority over prisoners. Their presence was not accidental. It was policy. Many of these women wore uniforms. Others wore civilian dress, but carried official documentation. All operated under the same ideological framework. American forces encountered them everywhere. In abandoned offices, records showed female signatures authorizing deportations, ration reductions, and disciplinary actions. In camps, survivors identified women as overseers. In town halls, American military governors found female officials who had run daily administration while men were drafted or killed. The shock was not that women had participated, but how routinely they had exercised power. For American occupation authorities, this posed a problem. Denazification had been designed around visible hierarchy, party officials, officers, industrial leaders. Women disrupted that model. Their ranks were often unclear. Their titles were vague. Their authority had been informal but real. This ambiguity did not spare them scrutiny. In some ways, it intensified it. U.S. policy emphasized individual responsibility. The idea that women were merely following orders did not align with evidence. Documents showed initiative. Witness testimony showed command. Files showed long-term commitment. By late summer 1945, August directives clarified the issue. Women who had held supervisory or ideological roles were to be classified no differently than men. Rank was not measured by insignia, but by influence. Screening centers adjusted accordingly. Separate processing lines were established in some locations. Female interpreters were assigned. American officers, many of them young and recently out of combat, now conducted interviews that upended traditional assumptions of gender and authority. The oath itself was standardized. It required a clear declaration, rejection of National Socialism in all forms, acknowledgement of Allied authority, commitment not to participate in any Nazi organization, present or future. In some cases, it was signed privately. In others, it was spoken aloud before witnesses. For women who had been trained to embody ideological certainty, this moment was destabilizing. The state that had defined their purpose was gone. The Americans did not argue with them. They did not persuade. They required submission to fact. The humiliation was not theatrical. It lay in reversal. Those who had once instructed others now listened. Those who had once enforced loyalty were now required to renounce it. For many, the loss was not only political, but personal. This tension between past authority and present powerlessness shaped every interaction that followed. It would define how the Americans approached these women and how the women responded when confronted with their own records. And it is through these encounters that multiple perspectives begin to emerge. For many of the women summoned to denazification centers, the first shock was not accusation. It was recognition. They had expected chaos after defeat, hunger, displacement, fear. What they encountered instead was order. Clipboards, timetables, calm American officers who already knew their names. Some arrived convinced their service had been insignificant. Clerical work, youth organization leadership, camp administration framed as logistics. In their minds, they had served a state, not an ideology. The documents on the desks told a different story. American interrogators did not raise their voices. They asked when the oath to the Führer had been taken. They asked how many subordinates were supervised. They asked whether directives were transmitted knowingly. Silence followed many of these questions. The humiliation came when memory failed to protect them. Records did not fade. Witnesses did not forget. The past returned, typed and stamped. For women who had drawn authority from belonging, isolation was devastating. In holding rooms, they sat apart from male detainees. No longer wives or assistants, no longer symbols of moral order. They were processed as individuals. Some wept. Others stared forward, rigid. The denial of innocence was not shouted. It was assumed. Denazification targeted belief as much as behavior. The oath was designed to fracture identity. For years, loyalty had been cultivated through ritual, salutes, songs, collective affirmation. The Americans reversed the process. They stripped away spectacle and left only words on paper. To sign was to accept defeat not only militarily, but ideologically. Psychological reports from the period noted resistance patterns. Some women minimized, others intellectualized. A few attempted moral deflection, citing family pressure or economic necessity. The oath allowed none of this. It demanded clarity. The act of renunciation, especially when spoken aloud, produced visible distress. Voices faltered. Hands shook, not because the words were complex, but because they severed the last link to a vanished world. For the American officers, this was intentional. Ideology, they believed, survived in silence. It had to be named and rejected. Perhaps the most destabilizing aspect was the collapse of gender expectations. Nazi ideology had glorified women as moral guardians, mothers, educators, symbols of racial virtue. Denazification stripped away that protection. American policy made no allowances for symbolic status. Authority was authority. Responsibility was individual. For the women involved, this felt like exposure. They were not being judged as women, but as functionaries. The humiliation was not that they were made to swear, but that they were treated as capable of guilt. This shift marked a turning point in how post-war justice would be applied. And yet, from the American side, another perspective was forming, one shaped not by emotion, but by doctrine and control. For the U.S. Army, denazification was never meant to be emotional. It was operational. American officers administering the program were guided by directives issued months earlier. These documents emphasized consistency, documentation, and psychological impact. The goal was not revenge. It was prevention. Nazism, they believed, had survived once after defeat in 1918 because it had never been confronted directly. This time, there would be no ambiguity. The oath served multiple purposes. It created a written record. It forced self-identification, and it established a legal boundary. Anyone who later engaged in extremist activity could be held accountable based on their sworn declaration. Female officers and officials were included not to make an example, but because exclusion would undermine the system's credibility. American commanders understood that allowing women to retain ideological ambiguity would leave intact a significant segment of the former regime. Reports from Ambient note that female denazification cases were often more complex than male ones. Ranks were unclear. Job descriptions were vague. Influence had to be reconstructed through testimony and documentation. But once established, the response was the same. To American observers, these women represented a particular danger. They were educated, organized, accustomed to authority, and in many cases, ideologically committed long after military defeat. Intelligence assessments warned that former female officials could become quiet carriers of Nazi belief within families, schools, and communities. This perception shaped how oaths were administered. Public renunciation was favored in cases where influence had been communal rather than hierarchical. The goal was not humiliation for its own sake, but exposure. Authority without symbols had to be neutralized. For the women involved, this felt like targeted degradation. Their belief had been stripped of context and treated as contamination. Denazification raised uncomfortable questions. Was an oath genuine if extracted under occupation? Could belief be legislated away? Did humiliation produce reform or resentment? American officials debated these questions internally. Some argued that forced renunciation risked superficial compliance. Others insisted that ideology had thrived precisely because it had never been forced into the open. What is clear is that the process altered power dynamics permanently. Once sworn, these women could never reclaim their former authority. Their past was documented. Their future was conditional. This moral tension reached its peak not in theory, but in practice, during the moments when oath-taking became unavoidable. Those moments formed the decisive turning point of the entire process. By late 1945, denazification in the American zone entered its most rigid phase. Temporary screenings gave way to formal procedures. Regional tribunals were established. Internment camps were reorganized into classification centers. What had begun as assessment became judgment. For female officers and officials, this was the moment when uncertainty ended. In places like Ludwigsburg, Darmstadt, and Moosburg, women identified as former Nazi functionaries were summoned under written order. The summons carried no explanation, only a date, a location. Failure to appear meant detention. They arrived carrying documents, certificates, employment records, letters of recommendation. Many still believed they could explain themselves. That intention dissolved quickly. The oath was no longer optional. In processing halls, American officers stood behind long tables. Interpreters read aloud the declaration in measured German. The words were deliberately plain. No rhetoric. No justification, just rejection. I hereby renounce National Socialism and all its organizations. Each sentence was followed by a pause. The women were required to repeat it. In some cases, witnesses were present. Former subordinates, local officials, other detainees. The effect was immediate. Those who hesitated were marked. Those who questioned were removed for further interrogation. Compliance was recorded with date, signature, and classification code. For women who had once administered loyalty oaths themselves, the reversal was complete. Interrogations followed the oath. Files were opened. Witness statements were read. In several cases, American officers confronted women with evidence of camp supervision, ideological training sessions, or administrative enforcement of racial laws. The tone remained calm. The pressure came from inevitability. Some attempted defense. Others remained silent. A few protested that they had never fired a weapon. The Americans did not argue. Authority had never required a rifle. By winter, classification decisions were issued. Categories determined everything: employment bans, ration eligibility, freedom of movement. For many women, the oath marked the exact moment they ceased to be anything but former Nazis. The transformation was not symbolic. It was bureaucratic and could not be undone. But the process did not end with signatures. For some, the consequences went further into confinement, exposure, and a final stripping of identity. After the oath, the waiting began. Women classified as major or active supporters were not released. They were escorted to holding areas, sometimes within the same facility, sometimes transferred under guard to internment camps repurposed for denazification. These were not prisons in the conventional sense, but they were not voluntary spaces either. In former military barracks and fenced compounds, hundreds of women lived under observation. Their days were regulated. Roll calls replaced routines they once controlled. Meals were standardized. Privacy disappeared. Here, the humiliation deepened, not through violence, but through exposure. American administrators posted classification lists publicly. Names appeared beside categories. Former ranks meant nothing now. A youth leader stood beside a camp guard. An administrative officer beside a typist. The ideology that had organized them was gone. Only accountability remained. For some, the oath returned in memory with new weight. What had been spoken once now followed them everywhere. Attempts to justify the past were met with silence. Appeals were processed slowly. Many were denied. Psychological assessments from this period note a distinct shift. Initial defiance faded into resignation. The collapse of identity was gradual but thorough. Without uniforms, titles, or collective affirmation, belief lost structure. Not all accepted it. A minority attempted passive resistance. They refused re-education lectures. They avoided discussion. Some withdrew entirely. American reports labeled this group unreliable but contained. Others complied fully. They attended ideological instruction. They wrote statements. They sought early release. In doing so, they acknowledged what the oath had formalized, that the system they had served was finished. By 1946, releases began. Conditions applied: employment restrictions, surveillance, permanent records. For the women involved, freedom came altered. They returned to towns where their past was known, where signatures remained in files, where authority had evaporated. The oath had done its work. It had not erased belief in every case, but it had ended power. And for the American occupation, that was the turning point. The consequences of this moment would ripple outward into German society, into Allied policy, and into the lives of these women long after the camps closed. The immediate consequences of denazification were administrative, but their impact was deeply personal. Once classification decisions were finalized, each woman's future narrowed into a set of restrictions. Those labeled as major offenders or active supporters were barred from public employment indefinitely. Teaching, civil service, journalism, social work. Entire professions were closed to them. For others, bans were temporary but renewable, contingent on continued compliance. Employment was not the only constraint. Ration cards were tied to classification status. Housing permissions were reviewed. Travel between districts required approval. In a defeated and impoverished Germany, these limitations shaped daily survival. Denazification was no longer an abstract judgment. It determined access to food, work, and movement. American military government records from 1945 to 1947 show that women made up a significant portion of those processed under ideological categories. Not because of numbers alone, but because of documentation. Their work had left paper trails. Offices, camps, and organizations had relied on meticulous record-keeping. The same bureaucracy that once empowered them now defined their culpability. Public perception shifted quickly. In many towns, notices were posted listing individuals prohibited from holding responsibility. Names were read without explanation. For women accustomed to social authority, teachers, welfare supervisors, youth leaders, the reversal was stark. Respect dissolved into distance. Silence replaced acknowledgement. Some attempted reintegration quietly. They took menial work under assumed neutrality. Others moved to unfamiliar districts where their past was less visible. A few appealed repeatedly, submitting affidavits from neighbors or clergy. Outcomes varied, but the process was slow and impersonal. American administrators monitored these cases closely. Internal reports acknowledged the strain. Denazification was proving more complex than anticipated. Ideological categories blurred under economic necessity. Skilled workers were scarce. Pressure mounted to relax restrictions. By late 1946, policy began to shift. The most severe classifications remained, but lesser categories were reconsidered. Conditional releases increased. Employment bans shortened. The priority was stabilization. For many women, this marked a second turning point. Not a return to authority, but a path back into civilian anonymity. Yet the records did not disappear. Files were archived. Oaths remained binding. The humiliation of renunciation had been formalized, preserved in ink and carbon copies. And as Germany rebuilt under Allied oversight, the long-term implications of this process, both for the women involved and for the nation they re-entered, began to take shape. As the occupation entered its third year, denazification slowly receded from the foreground of daily life, but it never fully disappeared. In 1947 and 1948, responsibility for many denazification proceedings was transferred from American military courts to German-run tribunals under Allied supervision. This shift altered tone more than substance. Procedures became familiar. Language softened. But the records compiled during the earliest, most rigorous phase remained decisive. For women who had sworn off Nazism under American authority, the long-term consequences unfolded quietly. Few spoke publicly about their experience. The oath had marked an end not only to ideology, but to voice. Many rebuilt their lives through silence, raising families, working in marginal roles, avoiding attention. The humiliation they had felt in 1945 was not revisited openly, but it shaped behavior. German society, focused on survival and reconstruction, did not dwell on individual culpability for long. Collective memory moved forward selectively. The suffering of defeat overshadowed the mechanics of accountability. Yet beneath that surface, denazification had altered norms. Women who once held ideological authority no longer claimed moral leadership. The post-war generation grew up without the rituals that had once defined loyalty. Schools taught caution. Institutions avoided overt ideology. The fear of enforced renunciation lingered as a warning. From the American perspective, assessments were mixed. Some officials argued that the process had been too rigid, too humiliating, particularly for women whose authority had been indirect. Others maintained that leniency would have allowed ideology to persist unchallenged within households and communities. What is beyond dispute is that the oath served its intended function. It created a line that could not be crossed again. Public denial of Nazism, once recorded, made its open return legally and socially impossible. By the time the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, the most visible phase of denazification was over. But its psychological architecture remained. Authority now required distance from ideology. Power demanded accountability. Silence replaced slogans. For the women who had stood under American supervision and sworn off Nazism, history had moved past them. Their former roles dissolved into footnotes and files. But the moment of renunciation, quiet, procedural, irreversible, remained one of the clearest markers of Germany's transformation. And in that transformation lies the deeper meaning of what those oaths represented. The image remains, a line of women standing under harsh lights, pens in hand, eyes fixed on strangers who hold the authority of a defeated nation. It was not a battlefield, but a crucible. No gunfire, no explosions, only words and paper. And yet, in that stillness, history shifted. The oaths they signed were more than legal instruments. They were symbols of collapse, markers of ideological defeat, and tools of societal reconstruction. The act of renunciation reduced an entire worldview to ink on a page. For the women involved, it was profoundly personal, a forced reckoning with choices, ambition, and loyalty. For Germany, it was institutionalized accountability, the first step toward rebuilding a nation stripped of its former ideological core. Denazification, and the inclusion of women within it, reveals the quiet power of bureaucratic authority. Humiliation need not be violent to be effective. Ideology can be dismantled methodically, sentence by sentence, signature by signature. The American approach demonstrated that societal transformation can emerge from structure, procedure, and the consistent assertion of moral and political order. Yet the story also leaves space for reflection. How do we balance justice with dignity, authority with humanity? These women were both perpetrators and products of a system. Their renunciation, imposed or reluctant, was a testament to the complex intersection of ideology, gender, and defeat. In the end, the oaths marked closure, not only for the individuals involved, but for a society forced to confront the consequences of collective belief. And as Germany slowly rebuilt, the ink that had traced each declaration of denial remained a silent witness, a reminder that power is transient, and that the human spirit, even when complicit, can be compelled to reckon with truth. This quiet moment of procedural, irreversible accountability became a cornerstone of post-war justice, a testament to the subtle but enduring mechanisms through which a defeated nation confronts itself.